David stood frozen at the door of the hospital room, his hand lingering on the cold metal handle. The faint beeping of machines and the soft hum of hospital lights created a surreal backdrop to the storm of emotions brewing inside him. His wife, Emma, was lying on the bed, pale and fragile, hooked up to a myriad of machines that were now keeping her alive. Just a few days ago, their lives had been ordinary. Now, nothing would ever be the same. He couldn't bear to look at her anymore, not like this. The vibrant, lively woman he had known for most of his life was gone, replaced by someone weak, someone slipping away from him with every breath she took. Emma had always been the strong one, the rock in their relationship. She had held everything together while he managed his small business. Even when she first got sick, she insisted it was nothing. A bit of fatigue, a passing illness. That's what she told him. He wanted to believe her. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. And now, the doctors had confirmed his worst fears. Emma's condition was terminal. It was aggressive, fast-moving, and no treatment could save her. She had only days left, maybe a week if they were lucky. The words, "There's nothing more we can do," echoed in his mind, replaying over and over like a broken record. How was he supposed to process that? How was he supposed to face her knowing she was going to die? He had thought about it all night, sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside her bed. He had tried to come to terms with the idea, to find some way to be strong for her like she had always been for him. But as the hours passed and the reality of the situation sunk in, something inside him broke. He couldn't do it. He couldn't watch her die. That's when the guilt started to creep in. What kind of husband was he if he couldn't stay with her in her final moments? What would people think if they found out he had left her alone when she needed him most? He didn't know how to handle that shame. But even more overwhelming than the shame was the fear. The fear of watching someone he loved more than anything in the world slowly slip away. The fear of seeing her in pain, knowing he could do nothing to stop it. That morning, after another restless night of pacing the hospital hallways, he made the decision. He told himself it was what she would want. She had always been the type to protect him from pain, even at her own expense. If she knew how much he was suffering, she wouldn't want him to stay. That's what he told himself as he quietly packed up his things from the hospital room, glancing one last time at her frail figure lying motionless in the bed. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, each one a painful reminder of the little time they had left. David swallowed hard and stepped out of the room, letting the door close softly behind him. He stood there for a moment, staring at the handle, his heart pounding in his chest. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn around, to go back inside, to sit by her side and hold her hand. But he couldn't. He just couldn't. He needed to leave. He needed to escape the suffocating weight of the hospital, of the impending loss that loomed over him like a dark cloud. As he walked down the hospital corridor, his feet felt like lead. Each step he took away from her felt like a betrayal, like he was abandoning her when she needed him most. But he couldn't stop. The exit sign at the end of the hallway called to him, offering an escape from the nightmare he found himself trapped in. He reached the door, pushed it open, and stepped into the crisp morning air. Outside, the world seemed normal. People were going about their daily routines, sipping coffee, checking their phones, and chatting with friends. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and for a moment, David felt like he could pretend that everything was fine. But the weight in his chest didn't lift. No matter how far he walked, the reality of what he had just done followed him like a shadow. He wandered aimlessly through the city, not knowing where to go or what to do. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, fear, anger, sadness. He thought about calling someone, maybe his brother or one of his friends, but what would he say? How could he explain that he had left his dying wife in the hospital because he was too much of a coward to stay? They wouldn't understand. No one would. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. David found himself in a small park on the edge of town, sitting on a bench beneath a tree. He stared blankly at the people walking by, their lives continuing as if nothing had changed. A couple strolled past him, holding hands and laughing, completely unaware of the turmoil raging inside him. He invited them. They didn't have to face the nightmare he was living. As the day dragged on, the weight of his decision began to sink in deeper. He had walked away. He had left her. And now he had to live with that choice. But it wasn't just his choice anymore. Soon, people would find out. His friends, his family, the whole town would know that he had abandoned his wife in her final days. He could already hear the whispers, the judgmental stares, the cold shoulders from people who once called him a friend. They wouldn't understand. How could they? They hadn't seen what he had seen. They hadn't felt the helplessness that came with watching someone you love die. The afternoon sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park. David hadn't moved from the bench, his mind still racing, replaying the moment he walked out of the hospital over and over again. He wanted to believe he had made the right decision, that leaving was the best thing for both of them. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. He had walked away not for her sake, but for his own. He was too afraid to stay, too weak to face the reality of losing her. As the sky darkened and the stars began to twinkle overhead, David made his way home. His small house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and empty. He stood in the doorway, staring into the dark living room, unable to bring himself to go inside. This was supposed to be their home, the place they had built together, filled with memories of their life as a couple. Now it was just a reminder of what he had lost. He sat down on the front steps, burying his face in his hands. For the first time since he left the hospital, the tears came. They fell silently, mixing with the cool night air, as the weight of his decision finally crushed him. He had abandoned his wife, and there was no going back. Little did he know, though, that his choice would set off a chain of events that would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire community. Because sometimes the decisions we make in our darkest moments have consequences far beyond what we could ever imagine. And for David, the consequences were just beginning to unfold. The morning after David left the hospital, the town buzzed with an uneasy sense of quiet. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, where no secret could be kept for long. News had already begun to circulate, slowly at first, then gathering momentum like a storm. People noticed Emma's absence from her usual spots, the small bakery where she would grab a pastry before work, the grocery store where she always exchanged a smile with the cashier. For a few days, people assumed she was just under the weather, nothing too serious. But then, word began to spread that it was much worse than that. Mrs. Klein, the nurse from the hospital who also lived in town, was the first to slip the information to a few close friends. "It's terminal," she whispered one morning over coffee with her sister at the diner, her face drawn and somber. "She doesn't have much time left." The words echoed through the diner like a gust of cold wind, chilling those who overheard. From there, the whispers spread through the town like wildfire. Emma, the kind, warm-hearted woman everyone knew, was dying. It wasn't long before the whispers turned to shock as another piece of the story came to light. David had left her. People didn't know what to make of it at first. Had he abandoned her in her most vulnerable moment? Had their marriage been a sham all along, a facade of happiness hiding deeper cracks? Questions swirled in hushed tones over fences and in local shops. Theories started to form, fueled by the town's insatiable curiosity. At first, there were those who tried to make excuses for David. "He's probably just overwhelmed," one neighbor said while unloading her groceries. "It's a lot for one person to handle. Maybe he just needs space to think." Others nodded in agreement, offering sympathetic murmurs. After all, grief could do strange things to people. Maybe he was just scared. But the longer David stayed away from Emma's side, the more the sympathy began to fade, replaced by confusion and then judgment. It wasn't just the fact that he had left her at the hospital. It was that no one had seen him since. Not at his store, not in town. He had simply disappeared, leaving the community to wonder what kind of man could abandon his wife in her final days. A week passed, and the judgment grew harsher. At the local barbershop, conversations that started off innocently soon turned into pointed accusations. "I always thought there was something off about him," one of the older men said, shaking his head as he read the newspaper. "Never struck me as the type who could handle real hardship." "You can't just walk out on your wife when she's dying," another chimed in. "That's not something you come back from." "I heard he couldn't handle it. Just up and left her," someone else added, sipping their coffee. "What kind of man does that?" The bartender, who had known David since they were kids, remained quiet. He didn't want to believe that the man he had grown up with could be so heartless, but the evidence was damning. The town saw what they saw. David was nowhere to be found, and Emma was in her hospital bed, alone. Emma's best friend, Sarah, was one of the few people who hadn't yet passed judgment. She had known both David and Emma for years, ever since they had first moved to town. She had been there through the good times and the bad, a constant presence in their lives. And yet even she found herself struggling to understand what had happened. She had visited Emma in the hospital several times, holding her hand, talking softly to her while she slept, trying to offer whatever comfort she could. But every time she visited, there was an empty chair where David should have been. Sarah tried calling him, again and again, but her calls went straight to voicemail. She left messages, pleading with him to come back, to be there for Emma in her final days. But the silence on the other end of the line was deafening. What could possibly keep him away? Was he so consumed by grief that he had lost his mind? Or was there something more to the story, something that none of them understood? The unanswered questions gnawed at Sarah until she couldn't stand it anymore. She needed to know why. She needed to hear it from David himself. One afternoon, after another visit to the hospital where Emma had slipped in and out of consciousness, Sarah made up her mind. She drove across town to David's house, the house where he and Emma had built their life together. It was a modest home, nestled on a quiet street, with a garden that Emma had lovingly tended to. But as Sarah pulled up to the driveway, she was struck by how different the place felt. The once vibrant garden was overgrown, the windows dark, and the air around it heavy with neglect. She hesitated for a moment before getting out of the car, her heart pounding in her chest. What would she say? How could she confront him? What if he refused to talk? Or worse, what if he was no longer there? Steeling herself, she walked up to the front door and knocked. The sound echoed through the empty house, but there was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. Just as she was about to turn and leave, she heard movement from inside. Footsteps, faint and hesitant. A moment later, the door creaked open, and there stood David, looking like a shadow of the man she once knew. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt, and he seemed to have aged years in the span of days. He didn't say anything, just stared at her, as if he had been expecting this moment, but dreading it all the same. "David," Sarah said softly, struggling to keep her voice steady. "We need to talk." He didn't respond, just stepped aside to let her in. The inside of the house was no better than the outside. It was dark, cluttered, as if he hadn't bothered to clean or care for anything since Emma had gone into the hospital. Sarah could feel the weight of the place, the sadness that clung to the walls. They sat in the living room, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Sarah didn't know where to start, but finally she found her voice. "Why did you leave her?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why haven't you gone back?" David let out a long, shaky breath and buried his face in his hands. For a moment, Sarah thought he might break down, but instead, he just sat there, silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, barely above a whisper. "She told me to," he said, his words hanging in the air like a confession. Sarah stared at him, not understanding. "What do you mean she told you to?" David looked up at her, his eyes filled with pain. She told me she didn't want me to watch her die. She made me promise that I wouldn't stay. She said she wanted me to remember her the way she was, not like this." Sarah's heart sank as she listened to him. Could that really be true? Could Emma have asked David to leave her, to abandon her in her final days out of some misguided attempt to protect him? It didn't make sense. Emma was the type of person who always put others first, who would never want to be a burden on anyone. But would she really go so far as to push her husband away at the end of her life? David continued, his voice cracking as he spoke. "I didn't want to leave her, Sarah. But I couldn't. I couldn't watch her go through this. She was always the strong one. She was always the one who took care of everything. And now I couldn't even be there for her. I couldn't handle it. So I left. I thought it was what she wanted." For a moment, Sarah didn't know what to say. She could see the anguish in David's eyes, the guilt that weighed him down. But there was still something that didn't sit right with her. "If that's true," she said slowly, "then why haven't you been back? Even if she asked you to leave, you don't have to stay away forever. She needs you, David. You need to be there for her." David shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "I can't. I just can't." Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock at the door. David froze, his eyes wide with fear. They both sat in silence for a moment, staring at the door as the knock came again, louder this time. Sarah stood up, her heart racing. Who could it be? What did they know? As she reached for the door, a feeling of dread washed over her. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything. And when she opened the door, she realized just how right she was. The knock at the door reverberated through the room like a warning bell. Sarah's hand hovered over the handle, her heart pounding in her chest as if it knew something she didn't. David, still sitting on the couch, looked frozen in place, his wide, fearful eyes locked on the door. Whoever stood on the other side felt like the embodiment of everything they had both been running from. With a deep breath, Sarah pulled open the door, expecting, she wasn't sure what. Another neighbor with questions. A nurse from the hospital with more bad news. But when she saw the man standing there, her breath caught in her throat. It was Officer Jeffries, one of the town's police officers. But more than that, he was a friend. He had known David and Emma for years, had shared drinks with them at town gatherings, and watched as their relationship blossomed over the years. He was someone who always wore a smile, but now his face was grim, his usual bright eyes dulled by something more serious. "Sarah," Officer Jeffries said, nodding at her before his eyes shifted to David. "David, we need to talk." David stood up slowly, his movements stiff and awkward, as if his body wasn't ready to face whatever was coming next. "What's this about, Jeffries?" David asked, his voice hoarse and dry. "If it's about Emma." "It is," Jeffries interrupted, his tone softer than usual but carrying a weight that couldn't be ignored. "There's been an update. Something's happened, and I think you're going to want to hear this." For a brief moment, the air seemed to still. Sarah's heart sank as she prepared herself for the worst. She immediately thought of Emma in the hospital. Had something happened? Had she passed away in the night while David was wallowing in guilt? The possibility was unbearable. Is Emma. David couldn't bring himself to say the words, but his meaning was clear. Jeffries shook his head, though the gesture wasn't entirely comforting. "No, David, she's still alive. But there's been a development. A strange one, to say the least." The room fell silent as the three of them stood in the tense quiet, waiting for the full explanation. Jeffries let out a breath, clearly uncomfortable, but this was a man who had seen his fair share of strange and difficult cases over the years. This, though, seemed to shake even him. "I think you both need to come with me to the hospital," he said after a long pause. "There's something you need to hear, something that changes everything." Without another word, David and Sarah followed Officer Jeffries out to his patrol car. The ride to the hospital was a blur of passing buildings and silent tension. David's mind raced, his guilt gnawing at him, twisting itself into something darker, more paralyzing. He could barely comprehend what was happening. One moment he had been drowning in his own despair, and now he was being driven back to the place he had tried so hard to escape. The hospital loomed ahead, its sterile gray exterior feeling even more imposing than before. When they arrived, Jeffries led them through the main entrance and directly to the nurse's station. The air inside was cold and filled with the faint, sterile scent of antiseptic. It was a sharp contrast to the warmth of the world outside, and it made everything seem more real, more terrifying. A nurse looked up as they approached. Her expression was serious, but there was something else there too, something that David couldn't quite place. Was it pity, curiosity, a sense of impending doom? "This is David, Emma's husband," Officer Jeffries said, gesturing toward him. "We're here to speak to Dr. Miller." He said it was urgent. The nurse nodded, her eyes darting between them before she picked up the phone and made a quick call. Within minutes, Dr. Miller appeared, his face solemn. He was an older man, someone who had seen the worst that life had to offer, but who still carried a sense of dignity in his work. Today, though, he seemed particularly unsettled, his usual calm demeanor strained. "David, Sarah, thank you for coming," Dr. Miller said, his voice even but heavy with emotion. "There's something I need to show you, something I didn't expect." David's throat was dry, and he could barely bring himself to respond. He simply nodded, and the doctor led them down a hallway to Emma's room. The soft sound of beeping machines filled the corridor as they walked, and with each step, David felt the weight on his chest grow heavier. He was going to see Emma again, after everything, after leaving her when she needed him most. He wasn't sure how to feel. Part of him wanted to run, to avoid the inevitable confrontation with his own cowardice, but something about the way the doctor and Officer Jeffries were acting made him stay. There was something bigger at play here, something beyond his own guilt. When they reached Emma's room, Dr. Miller hesitated for a moment before opening the door. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the pale light from the machines casting soft shadows on the walls. Emma lay in the bed, her face pale and still, but there was something different about the way she looked. She wasn't awake, but her breathing seemed more stable, her color slightly less ashen than it had been before. It was as if the rapid decline that had been expected had slowed, if only just. But it wasn't Emma's condition that made David's heart lurch in his chest. It was the figure sitting beside her bed. At first, he didn't recognize the man. He was tall, with silver hair and an air of authority that seemed out of place in the quiet hospital room. His eyes were fixed on Emma, a mixture of sadness and deep contemplation etched into his face. But when the man turned to look at them, David's breath caught in his throat. It was Emma's father. David hadn't seen him in years, not since their wedding. In fact, he had always been a distant, enigmatic figure in Emma's life. He had left when she was young, only reappearing sporadically in her adulthood. Emma had never spoken much about him, always keeping that part of her life private, as if it were a chapter she preferred to forget. David had respected her wishes and never pressed her about it. But now, here he was, sitting by her bedside as if he had never left. "Mr. Howard," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile moment. "What are you doing here?" The man stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and looked at David with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, his voice deep and rough from years of silence. "I've been in contact with Emma's doctors. She called me weeks ago. She told me about her diagnosis." David's mind reeled. Weeks ago, Emma had called her estranged father, the man she had barely spoken to in years, before even telling him about her illness. His heart ached with the realization that there were parts of Emma's life he had never been privy to, secrets she had kept even from him. "I didn't expect to see you here," Mr. Howard continued, his tone soft but pointed. "Not after what she told me." David flinched as if struck. "What did she tell you?" The older man sighed, his expression heavy with regret. She told me everything. About her diagnosis, about her plan, about how she didn't want you to see her like this. David's chest tightened. There it was again. The same thing he had told Sarah. The same justification he had clung to. But hearing it from Emma's father, a man who had been absent for most of her life, only made it feel more hollow. "And that's why you left her?" Mr. Howard asked, his voice quiet but filled with accusation. David nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotion. "It's what she wanted. She asked me to leave." But Mr. Howard's next words hit David like a punch to the gut. "That's not entirely true." The room seemed to freeze in that moment, the air thick with tension. David felt like the floor had been ripped out from under him. What did he mean, not entirely true? "Emma called me because she didn't want to put you through this," Mr. Howard continued, his eyes never leaving David's. "But she never asked you to leave. She told me that if you left, it would be your choice." David's heart pounded in his chest as the realization crashed over him. Emma hadn't pushed him away. He had made that decision on his own, because he couldn't handle the pain. The weight of his guilt threatened to crush him as he stood there, staring at Emma's frail form in the bed. I thought," David stammered, but the words wouldn't come. He had convinced himself that he was honoring her wishes, that leaving her had been for her sake, but it had been for his own. And now, as he looked at her lying there, still fighting for breath, he knew that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The truth was finally out, and David could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. Sarah, Officer Jeffries, Dr. Miller, and Emma's father. They all knew the truth now, just as he did. And there was no running from it anymore. David stood in stunned silence, the weight of the truth settling heavily on his shoulders. His mind struggled to process what Mr. Howard had just revealed. The reality that he had left Emma, not because she had asked him to, but because of his own fear, gnawed at him. He felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. He had told himself, over and over again, that he had walked away because it was what she wanted. Now, standing there in the dim hospital room, he couldn't deny it any longer. He had been a coward. The quiet room suddenly felt suffocating. The low hum of the hospital machines and the rhythmic beep of Emma's heart monitor were the only sounds, and they filled the silence with an unbearable tension. David's eyes moved from Emma's father to Emma herself. She lay there, so fragile, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She looked like a ghost of the vibrant woman she had once been. And David couldn't escape the crushing guilt that he had abandoned her when she needed him the most. Sarah, who had been standing quietly by his side, spoke up, her voice trembling with emotion. "David, I know this is hard, but she's still here. You still have time. You can fix this." But could he? David wasn't sure. He had left her. He had walked away when things got hard, when she was suffering. And now, after everything, could he just walk back into her life as if nothing had happened? He wasn't sure he deserved that. Mr. Howard seemed to sense David's turmoil. He crossed the room and stood in front of him, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the soft light. His presence was commanding, but his voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly gentle. "David, we all make mistakes," he said quietly, "but you have to understand that this isn't about you anymore. It's about Emma. She needs you now more than ever. Don't let your guilt keep you from doing what's right." David looked up, meeting Mr. Howard's eyes. He saw something there that surprised him. Understanding. This man, who had been absent for so much of Emma's life, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation better than David did. And in that moment, David realized that it didn't matter what had happened before. What mattered was what he did next. David started, his voice breaking. "I don't know if she'll ever forgive me." Mr. Howard placed a firm hand on David's shoulder. "It's not about forgiveness right now. It's about being there. That's all she needs." The room fell silent again, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. David looked back at Emma, her frail form a stark reminder of how little time they had left. His legs felt like they were made of lead as he took a hesitant step toward her bedside. Every instinct told him to run, to flee from the pain and fear that had been eating at him since the moment he learned of her diagnosis. But another part of him, a part he had buried deep down, pushed him forward. He sank into the chair beside her bed, the same chair he had sat in so many times before. But this time, everything felt different. He reached out, his hand trembling, and gently took hers. Her skin was cool to the touch, and her fingers barely moved in response. But as he sat there, holding her hand, he felt a rush of emotions that he had been trying to suppress for weeks. Grief, guilt, love, and fear, all of it flooded to the surface, and for the first time since Emma's diagnosis, he let himself cry. Tears streamed down his face as he sat there, clutching her hand, his body shaking with silent sobs. He didn't care who saw him. For so long, he had tried to be strong, to hold it all together. But now, in the quiet of that hospital room, he couldn't pretend anymore. He had failed her. He had left her when she needed him the most, and he didn't know if he could ever make up for that. But as he cried, he felt a strange sense of release. He wasn't hiding from the truth anymore. He was facing it. Sarah and Mr. Howard stood back, giving him space. They understood that this moment wasn't about them. It was about David and Emma. And as much as David wanted to believe he didn't deserve her forgiveness, he knew that this was his chance to make things right, even if it was just for a few more days. Hours passed in that hospital room, the world outside carrying on as if nothing had changed. But for David, everything had. He stayed by Emma's side, never letting go of her hand, watching as her chest rose and fell with each shallow breath. He spoke to her, softly at first, then more steadily, telling her all the things he hadn't had the courage to say before. "I'm sorry, Emma," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I'm so sorry I left you. I thought I couldn't handle it, but I was wrong. I should have been here with you, every step of the way. I don't know if you can hear me, but I need you to know that I love you. I've always loved you." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, it seemed like nothing would happen. Emma remained still, her breathing slow and labored. But then something changed. Her fingers, which had been limp in his hand, moved ever so slightly. It was just the faintest of movements, a twitch of her fingers, but it was enough to send a wave of hope through David's chest. He squeezed her hand gently, his heart pounding. "Emma, can you hear me?" Her eyes remained closed, but there was another small movement, a slight tightening of her grip on his hand. David's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't gone yet. There was still time. In that moment, everything felt different. The guilt that had been crushing him for weeks was still there, but it was no longer the only thing he felt. There was something else now, something stronger. Hope. It was fragile, like a flickering flame in the darkness, but it was there. For the next few days, David stayed at Emma's bedside. He never left her side, not even for a moment. He ate in the hospital cafeteria, slept in the chair beside her bed, and talked to her constantly, even when she couldn't respond. He told her stories from their past, reminding her of the life they had built together, the moments of joy they had shared. He didn't know if she could hear him, but it didn't matter. He needed to say these things, and he needed to be there. The nurses, who had initially been cold toward him after hearing about his abandonment, began to soften. They saw the change in him, the way he devoted himself to Emma in her final days, and they started to treat him with more kindness. Even Mr. Howard, who had been stern and distant at first, seemed to let go of some of his resentment. He came by every day, sitting quietly in the corner of the room, watching as David cared for his daughter. On the 5th day, something miraculous happened. Emma opened her eyes. David had been talking to her about their honeymoon, recounting the story of how they had gotten lost in the mountains and spent the night under the stars. He had been laughing softly to himself when he noticed her eyelids flutter. He froze, his heart racing, And then, slowly, her eyes opened. They were cloudy and weak, but they were open. "Emma," he whispered, his voice trembling. She blinked, her gaze unfocused, but after a few moments, her eyes found his. It was the briefest of connections, but it was enough to bring David to tears again. She was still there. She hadn't given up yet. "David." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "I'm here," he said, leaning closer, his hand still holding hers tightly. "I'm here, Emma. I'm not going anywhere." She smiled weakly, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but there was a flicker of recognition there. And in that moment, David knew that no matter what happened next, he had made the right choice. He had come back, and even if it was only for a little while, he would stay with her until the end. As the sun set outside the hospital window, casting a warm glow over the room, David whispered to her again, his voice filled with love and hope. "We'll get through this," he said softly. "I promise." And for the first time, in a long time, he believed it. David sat beside Emma's bed, his hand still holding hers, the feeling of her fingers weakly wrapped around his offering him a sense of relief he hadn't known he could feel. Her eyes had closed again, and she had drifted back into a fitful sleep, but the moment when she had opened her eyes and spoken his name played over and over in his mind. It had been such a brief moment, but it was enough to reignite the hope inside him. He didn't know how much time they had left together, but he was determined to make every second count. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft peeping of the machines and the occasional footsteps of the nurses checking in. David had stopped keeping track of time. Days had blurred together, with each one feeling like a lifetime, as he sat by Emma's side, holding her hand, talking to her, and waiting for her to wake again. He had made a vow to himself that he wouldn't leave, not this time, not ever again. But as he sat there, his heart heavy with both love and regret, a knock came at the door, soft but deliberate. David looked up, expecting to see a nurse or maybe even Mr. Howard, who had been visiting regularly. But when the door opened, a woman stepped inside that David didn't recognize. She was dressed in a crisp, professional outfit, clearly not hospital staff, and carried a briefcase in one hand. Her expression was serious, but not cold. There was something almost gentle in the way she looked at him. "David?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. He nodded, standing slowly and feeling a sudden, inexplicable sense of unease. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" The woman stepped farther into the room and offered a small, understanding smile. "My name is Karen Matthews. I'm an attorney. Emma's attorney, actually. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something I need to discuss with you." Emma. She had some things she wanted to put in place before she became too ill to handle them herself. David's heart sank at her words. An attorney. What could Emma have possibly needed an attorney for? His mind raced with all the possibilities. Financial issues, arrangements for her care, or perhaps the formalities of her will. The thought of a will, of finalizing plans for after Emma's passing, made his stomach turn. He wasn't ready for this, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. "I didn't know she had made any legal arrangements," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know she was even in contact with you." Karen nodded sympathetically. "She reached out to me a few weeks after her diagnosis, wanting to make sure that everything would be in order when the time came. She was very specific about what she wanted. I've been waiting for the right time to come by, and with everything happening now, I thought it was important to discuss it with you." David glanced over at Emma, still asleep, her chest rising and falling slowly. It felt wrong to have this conversation without her being awake, but at the same time, he knew she had made these plans with the intention of protecting him. He motioned toward the hallway, stepping outside with Karen, and gently closing the door behind him. The two of them stood in the dimly lit corridor, the air heavy with the seriousness of the moment. "What is it?" David asked, his voice thick with emotion. "What did she want me to know?" Karen took a deep breath, opening her briefcase and pulling out a folder. Emma was always very organized about her affairs. She wanted to make sure that after she passed, everything would be as smooth as possible for you. She didn't want you to have to deal with any unnecessary stress or complications. In this file are her instructions, her will, medical directives, and something else. David blinked, confused. Something else. Karen nodded and handed him a small sealed envelope. This is a letter. She wrote it for you. It's dated from about a month ago, after her diagnosis was confirmed. She told me to give it to you when the time felt right. David stared at the envelope, his name written in Emma's neat handwriting on the front. His hands trembled as he took it from Karen, the weight of the paper feeling like far more than it should. A letter. What had she written? What could she have possibly needed to say that she couldn't tell him in person? Should I read it now? He asked, his throat dry. Karen shook her head gently. That's up to you. There's no rush. She wanted you to have it when you were ready, but she didn't specify when that would be. David nodded absently, his eyes still fixed on the envelope. He felt a flood of emotions, fear, guilt, curiosity, and most of all, an overwhelming sense of love for the woman lying in the room behind him. Emma had always been thinking ahead, always making sure that things were taken care of. Even in her weakest moments, she had been planning for a future that didn't include her. The thought broke David's heart. Karen, sensing that he needed time, quietly excused herself, leaving him standing in the hallway, alone with the letter. For a long moment, he just stood there, unsure of what to do. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, suffocating him in a way that made it hard to breathe. He looked down at the envelope again, running his thumb over the ink of his name, and finally decided. He couldn't wait. He needed to know what Emma had written. He walked back into Emma's room and sat down in the chair beside her bed, the envelope still clutched in his hand. His heart pounded as he carefully opened it, pulling out a single sheet of paper. His hand shook as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words that his wife had written in her unmistakable handwriting. David, by the time you read this, I know things will be different. I don't know what state I'll be in, or how much time we have left, but there are some things I need to say. Things I don't think I'll have the strength to say out loud when the time comes. First of all, I want you to know that I love you. I've always loved you. From the moment we met, through all the ups and downs, that has never changed. You've been my best friend, my partner, and the love of my life. And I know that what we're going through now isn't easy. It's not fair, and it's not what either of us expected. But I need you to understand something. This isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. I know you're going to blame yourself. You'll think you should have noticed something sooner, or that you could have done something differently. But the truth is, there's nothing you could have done to change this. Sometimes life throws things at us that we can't control, no matter how much we want to. And I need you to believe that it's okay. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to feel lost. It's okay to cry. You don't have to be strong all the time. I also need you to know that I understand why you left. I saw the pain in your eyes every time you looked at me, and I knew you were struggling. I didn't want to be the cause of your suffering. I didn't want you to watch me fade away. And so I pushed you away because I thought it would be easier for you, but I was wrong. I see that now. I should have let you in. I should have let you stay, even when things were hard. But I want you to know that I don't hold it against you. You did what you thought was right, and I forgive you. I don't know how much time we have left together, but I want you to promise me something. Promise me that when I'm gone, you'll keep living. Don't let this destroy you, David. Don't let my illness become the thing that defines your life. You have so much more to give, so much more to experience. I want you to find happiness again. It might take time, and it won't be easy, but I believe in you. You're going to be okay, David. I promise. And I'll be with you, always. In the memories we made, in the love we shared, and in the strength you'll find within yourself. With all my love, now and forever, Emma. David's hands trembled as he finished reading the letter, tears streaming down his face. He clutched the paper to his chest, his heart breaking and healing all at once. Emma had known him better than he knew himself. She had seen his fear, his guilt, and had loved him through it all. And in her final days, she had given him the one thing he needed most: forgiveness. As the sun began to set outside the hospital window, casting a warm, golden light over the room, David felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had been given a second chance. He had come back in time to be with her, to hold her hand through her final days. And though he didn't know what the future held, he knew one thing for certain. He would keep his promise. He would live. The following days were a blur for David, filled with a mixture of deep sorrow and quiet moments of grace. He stayed by Emma's side every waking hour, only stepping out for brief moments when the nurses insisted that he needed rest. Every time he left her room, even if just to walk down the hall for a cup of coffee or to splash cold water on his face, he felt a gnawing fear that something would happen while he was away, that Emma would slip away quietly, and he wouldn't be there to say goodbye. But each time he returned, she was still there, hanging on by a thread that seemed impossibly fragile. Emma's moments of consciousness were brief, her body growing weaker by the hour. But in those fleeting minutes when she would open her eyes and meet David's gaze, there was a clarity, a deep connection that passed between them without the need for words. Sometimes she would squeeze his hand faintly, and other times she would just look at him, her eyes filled with a love that seemed to transcend the pain and frailty of her physical state. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the hospital blinds, casting soft rays across Emma's face, David sat in the chair by her bed, holding her hand. The letter she had written him lay folded in his jacket pocket, a constant reminder of her final wish: for him to live, to move forward, to find peace in the life that would follow her passing. He didn't know if he could do it. The thought of living without her felt unbearable, like walking through life with a piece of himself missing. He couldn't imagine going back to their house alone, couldn't picture waking up in the mornings without the sound of her laughter or her soft presence beside him. And yet, as he looked at her now, lying so still, he knew he had no choice. Emma had made it clear in her letter. This was her final wish. She didn't want him to carry the burden of her illness with him for the rest of his life. She wanted him to heal, to find joy again. It seemed impossible, but for her sake, he would try. As the hours stretched on, the inevitable loomed closer. The doctors had told him it wouldn't be long now. Her body was simply too weak to continue the fight. Every breath she took was shallower than the last, her once strong heart now struggling to beat. David could feel the tension in the air, the quiet urgency that hung over the room like a shadow. Mr. Howard had come by earlier that day, sitting quietly in the corner of the room, his face lined with sorrow as he watched his daughter fade. They had spoken briefly, no harsh words, no accusations, just a shared understanding that this was the end, and that neither of them could change what was happening. Mr. Howard had left after a while, giving David space to be with Emma alone. As evening fell, the room grew quieter. The usual hustle of nurses in the hallways seemed distant, muted, as if the world outside had slowed in respect for the moment unfolding within. David had long since stopped looking at the clock. Time felt irrelevant. All that mattered was being there, being present with her, holding her hand, and letting her know that he hadn't left her this time. It was late into the night when Emma stirred one last time. David, who had been dozing lightly in the chair, was instantly alert when he felt her hand twitch in his. He sat up straight, his heart pounding as he looked at her, praying for one more moment of connection. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a brief, shining moment, she looked at him with a clarity that took his breath away. Her lips moved, barely a whisper of sound escaping them. But David leaned in, close enough to hear her faint voice. "I love you," she whispered, her breath soft and fragile. David's throat tightened, and he squeezed her hand gently. "I love you too, Emma. Always." A faint smile touched her lips, and for a second, It was as if the weight of her illness had lifted, leaving behind only the pure essence of who she was, the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. She looked peaceful, her face soft in the dim light. And for a moment, David allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't in pain anymore. But then her eyes closed again, and her body relaxed completely. The room grew still. The sound of the machines became a distant hum in the background, the steady beeping of the heart monitor slowing, each beep coming further and further apart until, finally, there was silence. David felt the moment her spirit left her body. It was as if a light had gone out, leaving behind only the shell of the woman who had been his entire world. He sat there, still holding her hand, as the reality of her passing washed over him. Tears blurred his vision, but he didn't sob, didn't break down. He simply sat with her, feeling the weight of his loss settle over him like a heavy blanket. The nurses came in quietly, their faces kind and full of sympathy. They moved around the room with gentle efficiency, turning off the machines, removing the tubes, and giving David the space he needed to say goodbye. He barely registered their presence. All he could focus on was Emma, his Emma, who was now gone. For a long time he stayed there, unwilling to let go of her hand, even though he knew she was no longer there. Eventually, though, the weight of exhaustion and grief pressed down on him, and he knew he couldn't stay forever. Slowly, with trembling hands, he leaned forward and kissed her forehead, his lips lingering against her cool skin for a moment longer than necessary. "Goodbye," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'll never forget you." When he finally stood and left the room, the weight of his grief followed him like a shadow. The hospital halls were quiet as he walked out, the world outside seeming indifferent to the loss that had just occurred. The night was cool, and the stars were visible in the clear sky, twinkling down at him as if they held some secret to the universe that he could never understand. He stood in the parking lot for a long time, staring up at the stars, feeling both incredibly small and unbearably alone. Emma was gone, and yet her presence still lingered. In the memories they had shared, in the love they had built together, she was still with him. And as much as the pain threatened to swallow him whole, he knew she wouldn't want that. He reached into his pocket and pulled out her letter, unfolding it once more. As he read the words again, the ones where she begged him to keep living, to find joy again, he felt a spark of determination ignite inside him. It was small, barely noticeable under the crushing weight of his grief, but it was there. Emma had been his life, his love, his everything. And now she was gone, but he was still here, and she had made him promise to live. The days that followed were hard. There were moments when the grief felt like too much to bear, when David would wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to feel Emma's warmth beside him, only to remember that she was gone. There were days when the silence of the house was deafening, the memories of their life together haunting him at every turn. But there were also moments of light, moments when he would remember something she had said or done and smile, moments when he could feel her presence in the quiet spaces of his heart, reminding him that he wasn't alone. Slowly, painfully, he began to rebuild his life. Piece by piece, he took up Emma's garden, tending to the flowers she had loved so much, finding solace in the simple act of nurturing life. And as time passed, the sharp edges of his grief softened, becoming something more bearable, something he could carry with him without being crushed by it. In the end, David knew he would never fully heal from the loss of Emma. But he also knew that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant living with the memory of her, honoring her in the way she had asked him to. He would carry her love with him, always, and though it wouldn't be easy, he would live. Because that was what she had wanted. That was what she had asked of him, and he would keep that promise. As the first flowers of spring began to bloom in Emma's garden, David stood outside, watching the sun rise over the horizon. The world around him was quiet and peaceful, and for the first time since she had passed, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He smiled softly to himself, feeling Emma's presence in the gentle breeze that rustled the leaves. And though his heart still ached with the loss of her, he knew that he would be okay. He would find joy again, just as she had promised he would. He would live. For her.